Welcome to the Systemic Lives Conversations, Imelda, an offering from Murmurations, which is the Journal of Transformative Systemic Practice. I am absolutely delighted to be in conversation with you. And there are many accolades to your name, including the development of the idea of the fifth province, which, maybe we'll have a chance to talk about. And you were working at the Fifth Province Centre in Dublin. I'm not quite sure whether you're still working there now. No.
We can
that was from we can talk about that in a minute. And you're also a member of the Taoist Institute, and you have a number of publications as well to your name, as well as being a very loved and respected psychotherapist, systemic psychotherapist, trainer, supervisor, and author. So welcome, Imelda.
Oh, thank you.
And of course, maybe something that we will talk about a bit later, you had this amazing Festschrift as a way of really acknowledging your contribution to the field and also how significant you have been to so many of us. And I always think about Festschrifts as something that's bestowed or as a way of honoring people who have really, really given us lots of gifts in the systemic field. And so you have that role, I think, in the systemic community, not just in the UK, but perhaps internationally as well. So we're really, really pleased that you're here. Those are some of the ways in which I have maybe introduced you, but I wondered how you might introduce yourself.
Well, I don't know, as somebody who's been extremely privileged and gifted with the acquaintance of so many wonderful people in my life, in my personal life, but also in my professional life. And nothing was planned. It just seemed to come my way and without any planning. Because I remember when I first met my husband, he said to me, "What's your 5-year plan?" And I said, "Don't have one. Really don't do plans." And he thought that he was quite shocked at that at the time because he was in business. And I began to think about it at that time. And this was way before, I really got well started on my professional life. And I thought, no, I never really had planned anything. I've been very, very fortunate and very looked after by the universe, I have to say. So I'd have to say that about myself. It's not of my doing, and it's really of the doing of the amazing people I've met along the way, not least the amazing Gail Simon or Cal, as she likes to be sometimes known as. And of course that all stemmed from KCC, which was my home in London. And while I was friendly with people in IFT and in the TAVI, and had very warm friendships there, my London home was really KCC. And my relationship there was particularly with Peter and Susan. So I had many wonderful years as their external examiner, and they very kindly, many times invited me to do workshops or teach or, just be with them. And I used to stay with Peter and Susan, and they're very precious memories. And then meeting all the wonderful students as an external examiner, just, some of the extraordinary, people who went through it was fantastic.
Well, I would love to speak and hear a bit more with you about some of these special people who've been part of your kind of journey. And I wonder if we can maybe rewind to the beginnings a little bit. I know you said something about sort of being looked after, by people in the universe, and I guess it would have begun with your parents and something about your family life. So I wonder if you can maybe say a little bit about where you got your name from, who chose it, and what was sort of life like in your family
Mhm.
as you were growing up?
Well, that's a fantastic story, my name. My mother, when she was 12, and she was confirmed in the Catholic Church, at that age, it's a kind of rite of passage. You make your confirmation and you enter fully the community, the so-called Christian community, and usually take a spiritual name or a name of a saint or something like that. And she was very taken with the story of a young 12-year-old, I think, girl from Bologna whose name was Imelda. And she wanted to make her first Holy Communion, which is the second rite of passage in the Christian journey, well, in the Catholic journey. And she was allowed by the Pope to make it at a very young age, again, a bit prematurely. And she died with ecstasy on receiving God into herself, as she saw it. So my mother was intrigued with this story. And so as a 12-year-old, she chose this name for herself. And she said, if I ever have a daughter, I'm going to call her Imelda.
Right.
So in a way, I was named by her when she was 12. But then when I was born, and in those days, you were taken to be baptized before mother was out of hospital. And so my father took me to the church with my godparents, and he put a different name as my first name, which was Florence.
Right.
Now, I love the name Florence because it's Fiorenza and, it's linked to the great city. And I know you spoke, no, it wasn't you who spoke with Laura, but Laura Frugeri took me there to Florence. But yes, she was the name of my godmother, whom I dearly loved. Florence was. So I'm Florence Imelda, but I've always been called Imelda.
Right. Okay. So the Florence is the invisible part of the story in
It
some
is
ways.
kind of, yeah. She was a wonderful woman, and she was, yeah. She was. Well, I don't want to really go into her story, but she was an amazing woman, and she left money for my education, which was the most important thing.
Mhm, mhm. It's a really important person in your life.
Yes, yeah.
Yes,
She
your
died when
godmother.
I was about 12, actually, interestingly, but yeah, she was
Interesting
a really
about the
important
sort
person
of
in my
the
life.
12, the age 12
Yeah, yeah,
and your namesake. But your
yeah,
mother had already thought about you from the time she was
yeah,
12 years old, the
yeah.
idea of having a daughter. And so where were you in the sort of the part of the kind of family? Were you the firstborn or
Yeah, firstborn. And then
firstborn?
I had a little sister who was 8 years younger than me,
Mhm.
who very tragically died in an accident when she was 13 and a half, when I was 21.
I'm sorry to hear that.
And yeah, so
Mhm,
that was, I suppose, when you talk about transitions, that was a major transition in my life.
mhm.
Um,
So was it the two of you?
yeah,
Yeah. And so
that was
that
us.
how would that sort of affected your transition? Because you were 21, you said at that time. How,
Yeah, I had just started in college. I was a late starter in university, and I was halfway through my first year. So I settled to do a pass degree, which you wouldn't dream of doing now. I don't even think there is a thing called a pass degree anymore. And I struggled a bit through college, I think, but I had met my husband about 2 months before she died. So they were kind of two kind of almost simultaneous events in some way. And yeah, so I had a good time in college. I worked mostly through it because my parents didn't really have the means to send me to college. So my working, what they did was they give me free board and lodgings basically, and looked at
Mhm.
my mother was a wonderful caretaker, so she looked after me and that. So and that's I was very fortunate in that sense as well. I had an amazing father who his mother died on his birth, and then he was sent off to be reared by his paternal grandparents, and then his grandmother died when he was 4, and he always said he was extremely fortunate not to have been put into residential care because his grandfather, who was a man probably in his 70s, reared him. And so my father grew up being able to do everything, and it was an all male household. And yeah, and then his grandfather died when he was 18.
He
And he
lost
was
his
kind of adopted by this woman who became my godmother.
Florence.
Yes.
Right, right.
And he lived with her, and it was through her that my parents met as well.
So
And
really significant in so many ways, this
yeah,
person.
yeah. And the house that she lived and where they met and where my father lived for 8 years is now a shamanistic center, which is kind of interesting.
Very
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Some kind of magic conspired them to be all
Oh, well,
together.
whatever. Yeah, it was, yeah, they got
Fate.
together, and
Mhm, mhm,
my mother was a bit older than my father. But he was amazing, because he didn't grow up with girls. And so while I was treasured as a little girl, he also reared me as a boy.
mhm. What are the ways in?
I played sports,
Mhm,
but he always gave me the names of heroines. So there was a Dutch athlete by the name of Fanny Blankers Cohen, who was riding high at the time. There was
mhm,
Little Mo, who was a famous tennis player. There was Maud Gonne, who was the muse of W.B. Yeats. There was Queen Maeve. She always had these female significant women that I grew
mhm,
up with, hearing
mhm.
about from my father.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So, what do you think his intention was from bringing you up as a kind of a boy, how you described it, and then giving you these female heroes
Mm.
to
Well, I
also.
think I don't. He didn't bring me up as a boy as such because my mother did most of the rearing because he was out working very hard for most of his life. Um, but he expected nothing. He didn't expect me to be a weak person. That's really it. It was when I played sport. When he would come in, he'd say, "Well, did you win and did you score?
Those are the important things for
Did
him.
you win and did you score?" Which was terrible in some ways, but it became a real family joke then. I'd come in and say, "No, you didn't win. I didn't score."
In anticipation of his kind of personality. Yes, yes. But sort of something about wanting you to kind of um not just enjoy those kinds of activities that may have been seen as being more for boys than for girls.
But both my parents were sports people. Yeah, my
Right.
mother played camogie, which is an indigenous game played with a stick and a leather ball.
Mhm.
And my father was an intercounty football player.
Right.
So
Wow.
so they yeah, so our house was a sporty household. Yeah, and my
Mhm.
sister was also very good at sports and loved sports,
Mhm.
as I was. I just lived for sports. Yeah.
Were there particular sports activities that you
Hockey
really enjoyed?
and camogie, a little bit of camogie, but I was a little bit afraid of camogie because you played with the stick in the air.
Mhm.
I was always terrified of getting hit in the head or the face, and I had been hit in the face. So hockey was really my game.
Right. Which is another kind of game where you could get hit, couldn't you? By
Yeah, but
that.
not in the same way. It wasn't
No.
as dangerous as camogie.
No.
Yeah, yeah,
They had to be fairly robust in the
yeah,
family. Yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So apart from sports, were there some other things that were sort of part of um either activities that were valued or things that experiences that you grew up with that was really important in those early years?
Well, I was expected to behave myself, and I was a bit wild, so that was a bit of a bit of a constraint. I had a great friend who lived 3 doors away from me, and we spent a lot of time together, running the roads, as my mother used to say. And uh, we were great readers, she and I.
Mhm.
So we would spend a lot of our time reading and like famous five books, Secret Seven, that kind of stuff.
Right.
But also as I got older, then in my late adolescence, my big hero was Che Guevara. And I would read anything that I could get hold of by him or
How did you connect with Che Guevara? How did that
no
come about?
idea.
No.
No idea, except my father was a trade unionist. It may have come that way, but I actually don't remember.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
You said something that really interested me. I wondered whether we might be able to just explore it a bit. You said you were wild during that time, and I was just thinking, what kind of time are we thinking about? Sort of what's the kind of era? What
Probably from the time
roughly
I could walk.
from the time you could walk, and what?
Probably until my sister died, really.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, it was pretty wild. Yeah.
And what would that have looked like? What kind of things would you have been?
Well, climbing trees that were too high and climbing out of a restricted play area and with my friend and going for walks or cycles and dredging the canals for treasures and, some things that were kind of probably quite dangerous at the time.
Mhm. So
Yeah.
it's a risk taker from quite a young
Yeah.
age in that
Yeah.
sense of kind
Yeah.
of breaking boundaries and sort of.
Yeah. But like
Mhm,
climbing and going off beyond, I suppose, the boundaries of where I should have been going beyond in terms of the area we lived in. We were
mhm.
always exploring the area, myself and my friend. So
And
we
I'm
were both good
wondering,
and bad for each other. And we're still very close friends. She was my bridesmaid and I'm godmother to one of her children. And, we're still joined at the hip in many ways.
that's quite amazing. So another really long-term kind of friendship with
Yeah.
someone who's
Yeah.
been very
Yeah.
important to you. And I was just sort of thinking about some of those experiences that you talked about in your family. You were saying about your father sort of being part of the trades union. Um, um, what about your mother? What was she doing, and what were some of the kind of maybe influences from
Well,
her?
she stayed at home to rear the kids, and she also took in lodgers because there wouldn't have been that much money available as like for most people in the 50s and the 60s. So her job was actually taking in lodgers and looking after us. And she was originally a children's nurse, so she was wonderful with children. And my parents played good cop, bad cop. My father was the strict one, and she was the one that would let me away with stuff.
And how did that work with you? That
Well, I didn't
those two
see that
different
until I was a
styles.
lot older that that's what they were doing. Yeah, and then I realized that's what they were doing, and yeah.
And did they kind of change in their role, or did they kind of stay in
No, it
that?
was pretty much yeah, the good cop, bad cop kind of stayed in role. I used to give out stink about my father, and I'll be always giving out about him. That guy couldn't do this, and you better be home because if your father finds that out, blah blah blah. So that was the game that they had decided to play. And I spoke with them later when I was older about it, and they said, yeah, they had to play with it. They didn't do it with my sister because she was a different child altogether. She wasn't wild,
Mhm, mhm.
like I was.
How would you have described how she might have been sort of at that time?
She was a good kid. The only thing she did that I didn't do was she broke toys. She was very heavy-handed with toys, whereas I didn't. My toys were always for such a kid that was all over the place. I didn't destroy toys or things.
Mhm.
But she was more heavy-handed. It's not she deliberately broke them or anything like that. It's just it seemed to get broken around her.
And I'm wondering because you said that transition to when your sister passed away, you were 21 at that time, and you were also meeting um with your husband,
Yeah,
the person who became your husband later on. Um, I'm just wondering, sort of, what what kind of those kind of experiences with your parents, with your sister, with the sports, with sort of breaking boundaries, being a sort of testing boundaries. How's that kind of developing your idea of yourself, and how did that kind of develop when you were at university? How were you seeing yourself? What kind of descriptions
Mm.
were you
Well, it
developing
was
about
kind of
yourself?
interesting. I don't think I would have gone to university at the time when I did if I hadn't met another friend, whom my close friend that I was talking about, that we used to roam the streets
Mhm.
together, she introduced them to me. And his father was headmaster of a boys' school. And he was very bright. And he kind of took me under his wing, even though he was a year younger than me. And he was kind of mentor, which was interesting. And he got me reading in a whole different direction, like philosophy and that. And I got interested in humanistic philosophy. And I was always a member of the Labour Party from very young,
Mhm.
from 18 or something like that. And I was kind of very aware of social issues and unfairness and inequality and that from quite a young age, probably due to my father. And my father was one of these people who knew everybody. There's a saying over here, I don't know if you're familiar with in England, but it's even the dogs in the streets knew him.
No, say that again.
Even the dogs in the streets knew
Streets knew
him.
him,
Yeah,
right? No.
he was an amazing networker, and
Mhm.
he just knew everybody from criminals to presidents. He was
Amazing.
he was, yeah. And for a working class man, it was kind of quite extraordinary.
Mhm.
But um, yeah, I think then when I left college, I did a social science degree, and I decided I really didn't want to be a social worker. But of course, that's all I could have been. So I went into social work, and then kind of liked some of it. And I worked in the community for about 2 years, and then I got a job at the Mater. It was a hospital, but there was a child guidance clinic attached to it, as they were called in those days. And they employed me because they were opening a new clinic in a high-rise area, and they wanted people with community experience. And so they hired me, and that was the start of a whole adventure, because it was in that clinic that people discovered family therapy. And I wasn't that keen on the kind of family therapy that they were talking about, because they were um, into Virginia Satir. Now, I
Mhm.
knew nothing about Virginia Satir, but it was too lovey-dovey for me.
Right.
I was more interested in how are we going to work, and how could we serve the people in the high-rise buildings. And now other people found a way to work beautifully with the people in the high-rise buildings using Virginia Satir, but I couldn't. I didn't have the capacity to see that. And I discovered the work of Salman Uchin at that stage.
Mhm.
And that was a real kind of door opener,
Mhm.
because I went to the States then to do my postgraduate internship, like work placement during the course. And I went to Philadelphia, and I met one of Sal's colleagues, who was a guy, wonderful Puerto Rican psychologist by the name of Braulio Montalvo,
Right.
who worked
Okay.
with him in New York
Mhm.
on the project that they did when Families of the Slums. And Families of the Slums kind of became my Bible. And then I found that I could actually join the family therapy community, but very much as a structural family therapist in those days.
Mhm.
Um,
Let me just pause you there for a minute, because there's so many different aspects to that. One was how you came into family therapy, and through that child guidance clinic, but also you taking the postgraduate kind of internship. How did that come about? Going from sort of where were you at that time? Were you in Dublin?
yeah, I was in Dublin, but I had been working at the Mater, and the Mater was the Mater Hospital Child Guidance Clinic was a very exciting place to be.
Mhm.
And I didn't see any other exciting places to be around Dublin. I was married at that time, and
What was the excitement for you? Can you sort of give us an idea?
well, the director of the clinic was into social psychiatry, and the administrator of the clinic was a Mercy nun, and who was big into um, what was going on in South America, and the whole moving Paulo Freire and all that. So she was quite radical.
Mhm.
And so we were encouraged to be activists. And I set up a group called the North Dublin Social Workers. And we kind of spearheaded a whole child abuse campaign in the Republic, to get the issue on the table, the political table, and even into medical services and stuff. And that was all very much supported by the clinical director and this nun called Sister Joe.
Mhm.
And so it was a very exciting place to be. So a friend of mine decided, she was engaged to a guy who was living in New York. And she said, well, I'm going to New York for my placement. And I said, oh, I think I'll go to the States too. And so I applied, and our clinical director in the matter had a friendship with this guy who was the clinical director of another child guidance clinic in Philadelphia. And he said, yeah, I could come. And so I went there, and I was there for 3 months, and that was just amazing. And having weekly sessions with Braulio Montalvo at that stage, who was the most incredible observer of videotapes and family dynamics.
His name doesn't get mentioned as much, I guess, as Salvador Minuchin, and the other person is Harry Aponte, obviously. But
Well,
in
Harry
the
Aponte came later. I mean, Browley and that would have been mentors to Harry Aponte and people like that.
Mhm.
They came much later. I mean, there were, I think, at least, well, there's certainly one person between Minuchin and Aponte in
Mhm.
terms of the clinical in Philadelphia, in the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic. Um, no, Braulio was very much a background person. He wasn't a person who wanted limelight, or he was a very humble man, but he was a very wonderful man. And he also brought me over to meet Sal in child guidance. And he wanted to bring me down to Washington to meet Haley, because when Minuchin and Haley were writing the two books, Families and Family Therapy, and um, the problem solving therapy, I think was the one Haley was doing at the
Mhm.
time. They were based on conversations that the three of them had coming to work. That's Jay Haley, Minuchin, and Braulio Montalvo.
Right.
They were based on their car journeys to and from work. Then Haley wrote his book and Minuchin wrote his book. But if you sift through any of the Minuchin books, you'll see Braulio well mentioned. Yeah.
So you were really in the thick of that for 3 months. You were
Yeah.
saying about that work that you earlier on when you were talking about Virginia Satir, you were talking about how it didn't really fit for you. Other people may have sort of found a way of kind of translating some of the ideas,
Mm.
but where do you think? How were you thinking that made it sort of feel like there was a disconnect between those ideas, but connection with Salvador Minuchin's kind of structural
Well,
ideas?
Minuchin's structural family therapy was designed and developed around working with families, poor families in New York initially, and then into Philadelphia. Um, and that's who I was working with. You know, I wouldn't say I'm the most expressive person in the way that, say, Virginia was, or um, I'm not. I don't interrogate my emotions in quite the same way.
Mhm.
Um, Now, I met her a few times, and she was quite an amazing woman, but it just wasn't my thing, and it wasn't particularly anything to do with her. It was just not my
Oh,
thing.
it was sort of
Whereas now,
something more about your style and what
yeah,
fitted
and
with
like
you.
my style wasn't Minuchin's style of going in and conducting the session or anything like that. My style, without the genius, was more like Shakeen, was you sit on the chair and you just talk.
Do slightly more than just kind of talk.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was a total genius. I mean, his mind danced, and you could see it dancing. But I mean, he didn't get out of the chair and do all the stuff that Minuchin did.
Mhm.
So it was, yeah.
So there you were for 3 months in that placement with another sort of group of men, and I'm wondering whether you might
But
say some.
I had my two supervisors in those places were both women.
I was just going to say about the
Yeah,
place of women,
yeah.
because at that time there was well, we did hear about Chloe Modanis, but it wasn't sort of, it was sort of almost in passing as Hayley and Chloe Modanis. But so I'm just wondering if you could say something about some of those kind of maybe gender kind of issues and how,
I'm not sure gender was too much on my horizon at that stage.
right.
I didn't see myself any different to any man,
Mhm.
and mainly probably because I didn't have children, so and also my mother and father. Um, but I was aware of gender differences, of course, and I was aware of some gender difficulties. But I was more aware of social inequality than actually gender inequality.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I remember I didn't really cotton on to the feminist critique or anything like that until Monica McGoldrick and Carol Anderson and Froma Walsh ran two women's colloquia in the eastern coast of the States. And Nullig, my Fifth Province colleague, and myself were the only two European women there. And I remember somebody saying to me something about gender inequality, and I said, "Well, I didn't see it." Just, I remember when I was like you, my dear, and I thought, I won't say it, but I use bad language and saying, you can F off, Um, and but it struck a chord with me, even though I wasn't, I was a bit annoyed.
Mhm.
Um,
What do you think that annoyance was about?
well, I found her remark patronizing, you know, in the way that sometimes Americans can be patronizing because they don't think anybody knows anything but Americans. So it was a bit of that, and whereas my American friends that I hung out with, like Monica and that, weren't like that, you know. So, and I didn't feel the people in the child guidance clinics were like that either. So this was kind of jarring to me, and but all of the major women that subsequently went on to be names in the feminist field of family therapy were all at those two colloquia. Um, and I just listening to their stories and listening to what they had to say, it kind of began to ring more and more bells. And then I became a committed feminist.
That was a bit later before
It was
this
a bit later, yeah,
activist.
yeah. I was in
Yeah,
my
before the sort of the
probably late
activist.
30s, yeah.
Mhm. Say a bit about that activist because that and how that came about because I was thinking about the social inequalities, but also the kind of context that you had grown up with, amidst the sort of the background of the troubles and the difficulties that was going on. I wonder whether any of those kind of contexts affected your thinking about social inequalities and taking on the role of being an activist.
Well, the Dublin that I grew up in my early years was very monochrome. It was black and white and some shades of grey and brown and muddy white. But it was a hard place, Ireland, in those days, and it was quite poor. And we had a very restrictive, constraining church. Uh, so you felt you were being looked at and monitored all the time. Now, my parents weren't like that, so they weren't gung ho religious people, but they were quite religious in their own way, but not in the way that the church was so strict. I remember after my sister was born, I was 8 years old, and I went with her. She had to be churched after childbirth. That meant she had to go and be blessed, because she couldn't enter a church because she was deemed to be impure. And in my
Right.
8-year-old head, that was probably my first feminist awakening. And I was thinking to myself, how can this be? I was outraged by it at 8 years of age. And I remember walking home with my mother from the church. And it was interesting that she brought me as well, and just being furious. Like, how could this be? This was not right. And.
It's a very strong sense of kind
Yeah,
of
it was an
justice at the
extremely
age of
strong
8.
sense. Yeah, yeah, I remember. So I don't know. Maybe it was things I saw around me. I grew up in a kind of lower middle class, working class area. And certainly in school, I saw a lot of poverty. Um, maybe it was that. I don't have a memory of, being particularly awakened to it, It's just something like it seems like it was always there. I don't know. I don't know where it
For
came
some,
from.
yes, for some time. But and it's interesting the way you were contrasting the constriction and the constraint of the church and the kind of relative freedom and liberties that you had, that you were being invited to take up by your parents, particularly your father.
Mm-hmm.
And uh and I mean, I'm not quite sure how that sort of, those different kind of social contextual influences and then your more personal familial kind of influences, um how they might have kind of shaped that social activist that, activism that you were beginning to connect with, and that led you to go to
Well, my
uh
mother, in a way, was a bit of an activist. I mean, she was kicked out of school because she objected to way in her school there were orphans in the school, and the nuns treated the orphans differently than they treated the day kids. The kids who came in from their families. And one day, one of the kids was being punished, and she was put in a what would have been a coal hole in the school, which was there was a trap door, and she was put in anyway. And my mother objected to it, and she was told to go and kneel in front of a statue and pray for forgiveness. And she refused to do it, so she walked out of the school. And then they told her she wasn't coming back. And then after about a week, they sent for my grandmother and herself, and they brought her back, and they said she could come back to school if she apologized. And my mother said, "No, thank you very much," and she walked out. So there was a bit of an activist in her, and I always admired that so much. And it's interesting that that was around child abuse as well. So maybe she did more than just name me, maybe there was a narrative going on, although I don't remember it so much, but there must have been.
something about really standing up to
Yeah,
something that was kind of quite unjust.
yeah. And then
and
she
and
yeah, she refused to go to war. When she was a nurse, she trained as a nurse, and then of course the war came, and everybody with any kind of nursing experience was being drafted up, and sent out to the front or dealing with wounded soldiers when they came back. And she decided she didn't want to do that. So she went into service. She became a nanny, and she worked with and lived with a lot of the big families in England, including people who were related to the Churchills, and met all these people, and slept in the bed that Lloyd George had died in, and that. So she had an extraordinary kind of expansive. Now she grew up middle class. Her background was middle class. Um, so there were all sorts of stories around that of her just not going along with things.
Mhm, mhm. So
Um,
you had that sort of something that you would have been, would you have heard those stories about your mother
yeah, I would
from an
have, and her
early
standing
age?
up to people. Yeah, I would
Yeah.
have. And I always knew, like, for example, if I got into trouble at school, I would come home and I'd tell my mother, but I'd say, please don't tell daddy. Because I knew if my father went up, he'd be saying, yes, sister, and no, sister. And whereas my mother would say, look, she's here to be educated, get on with it.
Mhm. So really quite different kind of
Yeah.
styles, and yeah. Um, I mean, so your mother was more someone who would sort of be quite confident in taking on authority and even defying authority in
Yeah,
some
she
ways
was.
from
She
quite
was
early.
in a way, in one way, and yet in another way, you wouldn't have said that about her. But if you knew her and knew what she'd done in various situations, yes, she was like that. Yeah, she
Mhm.
wasn't afraid to stand up for what she thought her.
And so I'm wondering what you were taking from your mother and your father, in terms of kind of worldviews or influences into your adulthood, and then maybe going into your working life, as you started your working life, there particular kind of values, beliefs, or sort of ways of thinking that you think you took from your parents?
Well, I think probably justice, social justice was a big thing, ethics, and caring for people. You know, um, like my father really had no prejudices. The only thing that mattered to him was, were you a decent person? And I'd say I've probably inherited that. Maybe not to the same degree as my dad, but yeah, I would have been.
And so that sort of sense of um what you're describing about your father as that lovely expression that you said of even the dogs knew him. um his ability to really kind of go from one context to another and
Yeah,
speak to lots of different kinds of people,
yeah.
and
Well, he
your
was the
mother as
same.
well.
Funny enough, yeah. Even though my mother was middle class, and then she had this whole upper class experience in England. My father, even though it was working class, knew everybody, as I said, from presidents to criminals. But one of the people that he knew was a guy called Lord Longford. Now, Lord Longford was also an activist. He was one who brought about a lot of prison reform in England. But he also, with his wife, set up one of the theatres here in Dublin. So and my father knew him. And at one stage, my father came home with a tea set, a children's tea set for me that Lord Longford had given him, and his daughters had played with it. And do you know that one of his daughters was Boris Johnson's godmother?
Oh, really? So you've got
So
some
they were,
connection.
that's what I mean. Like he had so many connections everywhere. It was like extraordinary, really.
They're really difficult in some ways to really pin your parents down, even your mother. You were talking about sort of the different kind of social groups that she kind of went back and forth from as well. And just before we maybe go back to some of your early developments and connections with family therapy ideas and work, I wonder if you could say something about some kind of um I don't know, some maybe key defining experiences in your early kind of maybe 20s, early adulthood that really kind of stayed with you and had quite a significant impact maybe on.
Well, obviously, my sister's death, and then getting married, and going back to college to do postgraduate. And going to work in the Mater was certainly an amazing. That was a huge. Um, that was a huge transition point for me, and opened huge doors. And that's where I met the people who were going to be my team colleagues in Fifth Province, and we also set up the first family therapy training program um, in Ireland there in 1980. The three of us with another colleague, but later it was the three of us held it for the 4 years. And we began then in my early 30s to get invited as part of our teamwork for a few years. So we did that for a few years, and that was an incredibly rich, enjoyable period. And thanks to Monica McGoldrick and Lynn Hoffman, we got introduced to a lot of systemic teams in Europe and in the States. And Lynn Hoffman used to call together these teams conferences through the 80s, which actually were the breeding ground for conversations around the growth of Harry and Harlene's model. And at the end of the 80s, their paper came out, Human Systems as Linguistic Systems.
Mhm.
Tom Anderson's paper on Reflecting Teams came out, and our first Fifth Province paper came out, all in family process, at the end of the 80s. So that the 80s, and that was 20s into 30s. So that was an extraordinarily rich time. They were, amazing. And then my
As
40s was filled with traveling and workshops and conferences, and you know, um, people, from the family therapy world coming to stay in our home at the time. We had an open house for people coming through who were doing workshops or whatever.
Mhm.
And yeah, that was yeah, those years were just extremely rich. And in those I don't really see transitions. I mean, I loved Shakeen. Um, he became, I suppose, with Harry Gulishan, Monica McGoldrick, and Sal Minuchin were I would say, were my major mentors in the family therapy field.
Mhm.
And then I had a wonderful colleague who was my boss in UCD and also was my thesis supervisor when I did both masters and PhD. And he was a fantastic, Gabriel Kiley was a fantastic mentor to me as well. Um,
Can you say
so,
some? Sorry, you
well,
carry on.
no, it's fine.
No, I was just thinking about those people that you mentioned who were sort of the pivotal kind of influences, Salvador Minuchin, Chikeen, I think you mentioned Harry Gulishan as well. Um, what was it about those connections for you that were so important? Can you say a little bit about maybe something about the connections with them as people, as well as the kind of very bright thinkers that they were?
Well, they were all great drinkers and they were great fun. And that certainly played a role. We had amazing fun with them. And for myself, I liked them very much. You know, I was very fond of them. Um, yeah, and what they had to say was extremely exciting and enriching, and that. Like Harleen was much more our age group. Harleen and Nolik would have been around the same age. Um, so she was more like a peer to us, but Harry and Lynn and Monica, and although Monica was a bit more like a peer as well, and Shakeen were kind of more mentors, you know. I don't know whether Shakeen would have ever seen us as a mentor. He liked us, and all those people were extremely supportive of us and our work. So that was, they provided a kind of cradle for us in some ways.
Mhm. And you, the time that you were talking about, which was the sort of 80s, uh, where all of these kind of interconnections were happening locally and internationally.
Nationally, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, and then you actually being one of the pioneers of the first family therapy training in Ireland in 1980. I wondered sort of what what kind of, what were the particular memories that stood out for you about what how you were during that time, because it sounds like there was a lot of rich kind of connections, interconnections, but also that there's something about you too, that you were also contributing to the development of not only family therapy in
Mm.
Ireland, but
Mm.
to the development of other people.
Yeah. Well, I'm the only untrained family therapist in Ireland.
Is that say a bit more about
Well, I
that?
never did a training program, you know. I mean, I was in trainings and I did I suppose the best way you could put it, an apprenticeship to Nolly Byrne,
Mhm.
you know, long apprenticeship when we kind of worked together. Um, I'm calling it that. I don't think she'd call it that, but it was, yeah, because I joke now and say I'm the only unqualified family therapist in the country. Um,
It's a special status.
yeah, yeah, it is. um, so, hmm, what was the question again?
I I was wondering sort of what you think you might have also been offering
Oh,
and
what did
and
I
and
bring?
to other people.
Um, brass neck, I think probably. Um, uh, you know, because I was working with these people who were all trained. I remember one colleague said to me, "Well, you can't do that. You're not trained." um, but uh, I think that, and I think, yeah, I was a kind of an activist. I think I brought that kind of edge to it as well.
Mhm.
Philip Carney was in a way, but he was. in a different way to what I was. Yeah, and I had other friends who were maybe social work colleagues who were kind of activists, and so I think I probably brought that edge a bit.
How would that sort of
And I
have
used to tell everybody about our trips. You see, one thing in Ireland is you don't boast, right?
right?
Um, so the thing is, you kept quiet because nobody knew who we were in Ireland, but everybody knew who we were abroad. And so I used to share it with the students, and I'd say, we have been there and that. And so one time they did a skit on it, and I was called a has been because Imelda has been everywhere. So I think I probably shared more of what we did elsewhere with people. I don't know if that's true or not, but looking back, I know I did share it with the students I had.
Mhm, mhm.
Uh,
How did that sit with you, where you were obviously becoming much more known in that international kind of scene? You were talking about how people invited you to do
mm,
teaching and workshops in various places, and you were definitely, you know, socializing with the good and the great, with with you being part of that good and the great kind of
mm.
circle, and yet in your local kind of turf, if you like, you had to be quite modest and maybe not even people not even know exactly what you were doing. How did those two different worlds kind of sit with you?
Well, they didn't sit easy with me because I thought it was ridiculous, and I had no time for that shit here. I really didn't. And if people couldn't put up with it, then let them get on with it. I wasn't that interested. So yeah, I mean, I just really had no time for that kind of because if you look at a lot of our literary people around the 40s and 50s, um, they had to leave the country. If they stayed here, most of them became alcoholics. The only one major figure who wasn't of that kind of generation that wasn't an alcoholic was um, Seamus Heaney.
Mhm.
All the other big names had to get out. Now, I should say the other person who wasn't an alcoholic was W.B. Yeats. He didn't. But he had a kind of an upper class, well, what we called here West Brit, which was,
West
they were,
Brit.
yeah, it was kind of the Anglo-Irish, who the Irish at that time didn't see them as proper Irish, do you know?
Mhm, mhm.
Um,
Would that
but
have been some kind of like an aspersion, or was that
yeah,
West
yeah,
Brit,
if
or
you were
that?
If you were what we considered Catholic and Irish, those people weren't proper Irish, do you know?
Right.
I mean, it was a load of bullshit. but
But it
um,
was part of what
but
was
he
going
had
on.
he had a different community that kind of held him, I think, than say the likes of oh well, you wouldn't really know the people who stayed here. Yeah, a lot of them just were alcoholics.
Mhm, mhm. So there's
Um,
something about that need to also get out and be in different kind of contexts, professionally and
yeah,
personally, which is what you're doing. I was just thinking, sort of, in your family, whether your parents were still around at that time, and also um with your immediate family, your husband, and whether they knew about, the how you were seen in that international scene. And is it who would have known about that you were actually, right in the center of kind of some of the greatest developments that were kind of going on in
yeah,
family
yeah.
therapy?
Well, yeah, I think my parents did. I don't know that that would have meant a huge amount to them, but they were always proud of me. I knew that. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, Michael would have known because all of those people would have passed through our house, so he knew them personally. I mean, they were all friends. So it became like a friendship network,
Mhm.
not closed. It was never closed down. I mean, because I mean, one of the things that the Italians were fantastic was they never colonized their people outside of Italy. Like what they did in Italy, I have no idea. I know they had centers and things like that. But you could be influenced by them and they would come and they would share their work, but they didn't want to have any claim over it. So there was none of that. It was, so we would bring people that came into the country, like Chickeen or whoever it was, down to my father's pub, so in which would be a working class pub in a working class area, and it was always great. So yeah, they would have known. Yeah, I don't know that my parents would have known what it meant, or Michael had a business, he was busy, so um, yeah, but they did know. Yeah, and I was writing quite a bit, so I was quite active, and I
So
was
they would
never at home. I mean, that was the other thing. I traveled a lot.
yes, I was just thinking sort of about your all those different kind of travels. And I want I was sort of thinking not just about the people, but some of the ideas that were really influencing you at that time. Did it sort of match something about that progression of family therapy field across time, or were there
Yeah,
particular ideas that really
yeah.
struck
Well,
for you?
there were there were. I was very interested in the field, what I call the field ideas of family therapy, of systemic work, that you get glimpses of through parallel processes or um, um, abductions, like the thing that could occur in one field would be similar to what occurred in another. Um, I was really interested in that. And I remember in the very early days of our teamwork, um, being introduced to the work of Rupert Sheldrake, who was a biologist. He's a British biologist. And he had the notion of morphogenetic fields, which morphos meaning shape and genetic meaning creation. So, and it was a bit like the 100 monkey syndrome, that when a certain number of a species learns a particular action, it spreads across the world, and you'll have it happening in places far apart, similar things happening. So I was kind of interested in those ideas and how we saw them happening when we were working behind the mirror and as a team and in conversations with the families and the professionals around them. And I became much more interested in those than my colleagues. And then when I met my spiritual teacher when I was 51, when I met him, um, I actually learned in that way from him at a distance, because he was in the tradition of Indian gurus, and so I was opened up to that whole culture, and that has stayed with me. And it's I began to see it that it was like the quantum field, and very like a lot of what Bateson said, in some of his later works. He was kind of alluding to some of that stuff, and so those ideas, I think, really, really interested me, and in a way that kind of made a lot of sense of a non-impositional practice. That you couldn't go in and Maturana would have been an influence there too, of and Bateson, of course, big time, because I was a Bateson follower. I came across the ideas of Bateson when I was 18,
Mhm.
and so those kind of ideas, I think, probably were the ones that most fascinated me.
It
And I think that the Milan model is full of that, except it was never articulated. Like,
full
how do
of
you help systems, to see themselves,
mhm, mhm.
systems seeing systems. Um, um, which it has a kind of quantum feel to me as well. So yeah, and I've stayed interested in that. I'm
Mhm.
still really interested in that.
How's that kind of developed your ideas to now? Because you were talking about two different aspects there, that non-impositional kind of thinking and just entering into sort of systems. Um, and yeah, and then you were talking about the spiritual guru, that your teacher that you were involved with, that sort of brought you a different kind of a dimension. And that was at 51,
I
and
met
you
him when I was 31, yeah.
yes, and you're now at this wonderful age of
75 and a half.
75 and a half, which is just amazing.
It is.
Sort of, yes, almost quarter of a century later. Yeah, I mean, what are sort of what would you say are some of the ways in which those ideas, plus, all the richness of the different people that you have uh really interacted with and connected with over the years, how's that kind of coalesced into who Imelda McCarthy is, and sort of what are some of the ideas that are mulling around and enduring in her head?
Mhm. You know about Indra's net?
About?
Indra's net?
No, tell me.
Indra's net is, I don't know whether it comes out of the Buddhist tradition or whether it's an old Indian. I want to say it's an old Indian kind of metaphor or allegory, but
Mhm.
it's a kind of web, um, where at the node of the web there's a reflection of everything else that's going on in the web. So I think, if you have that idea of an interconnected field, so closely interconnected like that, um, then there's a way of seeing that there's no separation, that the separation is in the material field, but actually in a whole subtle field, immaterial field, that's not there. And it's a bit like, when you meet somebody and you're going to be friends with them, or, there's an immediate rapport that you
Mhm.
really do connect with them. And then you know things about them that you don't really need to know the details. Uh, that kind of sensibility, I suppose, got me to realize that really I'm as much part of that field as anybody else. And I'm organized by that field in the way everybody else is. And that's what I really feel, that who I've become is a gift of the universe. It's like that intimate interconnection with people and with ideas and with practices and with so the field has shaped me as much as anything I've ever done. And I'm extremely grateful for that. And I really feel that, it's something I experience. It's not something that's just in my head. Um, and and that makes the whole idea of any kind of instructive interaction or imposition actually almost impossible. Now, I'm not talking about when somebody's using brute force and, they're acting in psychopathic ways and stuff like that. And that's why I think our field, in it, with its kind of focus on context and understanding the context of people, of trying to understand how actually they got made like that, because they're not just aberrations, um, they make sense in a particular context. And Bateson gave us that, and certainly the Milan team gave us that.
Mhm.
Um, Probably more than other clinicians gave it to us. I'm going back a bit, and yeah, that's very meaningful for me. All of that is very meaningful for me now. So I've talked about meeting people in therapy as a kind of communion. That we commune together, and they teach me as much as anything that they would
Something
get from
quite
me.
spiritual.
Yeah, it's very like, and that's what attracted me to my teacher when I met him first, was how like what he was saying was to my systemic practice and commitment and experience and understanding.
Mhm. You
Um,
mentioned something about culture when you were talking about your spiritual teacher. Um, and we were talking earlier about how you came much later to feminism, maybe because you were already a feminist without knowing it for a long time, since you were 8, when you just said, how can this be, in that sort of experience in the church with your mother you were talking about. So I just wondered, sort of, if you could say a bit about how you came into culture and issues of race, ethnicity, and power in a different kind of a context, and where you think those issues are in the field now.
Well, you see, there was no culture and race in Ireland up until very recently. We saw ourselves as monocultural. Of course, we weren't. This was a grand delusion, uh, but you know, growing up, it wasn't something I had to deal with, and even in my young years, and through a lot of my professional life, I didn't have to deal with it. Which is very different now. We're a very multicultural society. 1/5 of the country weren't born here. So that's a very different country than I grew up in. So it, to me, people are people. We're all human beings. We have differences. We have cultural differences. We have life differences and experiences and all sorts of things. But there should be room for everybody, and to make to appreciate the richness of that diversity. Where I part company with a lot of what's going on now is that where the identities get frozen, where you have an identity politics that's almost cast in concrete. And to me, that is part of a neoliberal movement to create sitting ducks out of people, because you can divide and conquer. And a lot of inclusivity, I feel, gets lost in a lot of these conversations that I have witnessed of late. So I have severe reservations of that kind of identity politics.
What do you think is getting lost or has been missed?
I think the connection to people is getting lost. I think the connection to inclusivity is getting lost in this parade of how different I am. And it also fits very much with the neoliberal hyper individualism and exceptionalism. Everything applies to everybody but not to me. And entitlement. It goes with those three things. And I think when it becomes that, it becomes a distortion of what we are as human beings and trying to create inclusive societies. But as a celebration of diversity and difference, that's a different thing, but that's something we can share.
What
I'll tell you, the other thing that drives me crazy is this term decolonial.
Mm-hmm.
Because most of the people are using it are English or American, two of the biggest colonizers the world has ever seen. Mm-hmm. And to turn a verb into a noun, I think, is an extraordinary about face for people to make. If you're talking about decolonization, that's a different thing. It still stays as a verb in its verb form. Mm-hmm. But to talk about decolonial churns, I mean, what does that mean? Mm-hmm. That you have the previous colonists looking at themselves? Because in any of the writings I've seen, they're not looking at themselves. They're looking at the colonization done to other people, but they're not turning the mirror back on themselves. Mm-hmm. So those kind of things now I find difficult at this point in time.
So when it's the verb, because I guess that's one of the kind of developments in family therapy,
yeah,
as it is in other kind of areas, in almost of course, right, in the last few years, decolonization of the curriculum, of that what's being taught, who's teaching, all of those have become very
well, there's a double-edged sword to that, because if you want to decolonize what people are teaching, that's a critical exercise that needs to be done with anything we teach, and had been done. I think it's gone overboard, to be quite honest with you, but I can appreciate with minority students or where there's a lot of diversity, and that's not going, and you're getting some kind of dogmatic teaching. I think then a lot of that needs to happen, but it's reducing, I think, the real meaning of what colonization is. And that is when damage is done. So if they're talking about that, removing the damage in a curriculum to the students, then fine. But you can take that to the point of absurdity, like they're doing in America, where they don't teach critical race theory and they don't want, any of the science around how the world developed and all of that crapola that's going on. It gets reduced to a lot of that. And I think we just have to be very, very careful of those discourses. I really do.
In your thinking about your connection with social activism from quite a sort of young age, and now this kind of invitation into decolonization, I'm just wondering how that's shaping your kind of your role, your thinking as a trainer, as a writer. Are there
Well, I'm
some
not a
things?
trainer anymore. I
No,
do some supervision. I've stopped teaching. I've stopped giving workshops. But we were writing about colonization back in the early 80s. And our work mostly has been um, looking at the colonial impetus in some therapies, that it can be quite colonizing. Um, but the people who were writing about it at the time were coming from previously colonized places. There's too many of the colonizers talking about it now, and I think they're going to make it nothing.
that's your kind of worry about
That's
that.
a big worry I
That's it.
have
Yeah,
because I'm
that's it.
not impressed with what I'm seeing coming out of the States, and I don't like some of the English stuff either now.
What would you see as a much more acceptable kind of development, or what would you like to see in the way that family therapy is going to be moving? Because I guess that's one of the things that happens
Well,
with
you as a
the
somebody
field.
coming from a Bangladeshi background, that's what you said, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Your people know about colonization. The people of India know about colonization. The people of Africa know about colonization. The North American and South American native peoples know about colonization. You know, the Australian native people know about colonization. The Maoris, to a certain extent, know about colonization, but they were originally colonizers themselves. But, they do know about British colonization. To have the previous colonizers come out to be the top dogs on what a Jewish person knows what colonization is. But, you know, I think we need to be careful about who's talking about it.
And so, how would you what would you like to see in terms of developments? I guess I'm sort of
I'd like
wondering.
some of them to be quiet and listen to the people who have been colonized.
And just so you're not in teaching anymore. You're not you're
No,
and
tired.
so and the you're doing some writing,
Yeah.
um which you were talking about earlier. Um and of course you're seeing clients as well. That's
No, I'm
still
not seeing clients. No, I'm
no,
not.
you're not seeing clients
I
anymore.
I will see the very odd one, but I'm not seeing them as an ongoing weekly commitment. Yeah.
And
No, I've pretty much retired from most of that.
right.
I'm involved at the moment with a very nice small international group that Gail kind of set up with some colleagues. And she doesn't come to it anymore, but it's we call ourselves Ariadne's Thread, and it's an ecosystemic group. And there are people in that doing really interesting work, like taking the therapy outside the clinic walls and doing it in nature, and people doing some kind of native, like vision and fast quests, and being Babysonian scholars and people. There's a Norwegian who's a kind of follower of Arne Næss, who's the big ecological philosopher in Norway. And there's a wonderful woman from Greece who's been a social activist all her life and is living with, what everything that's going on in Greece at the moment and their relationships with the countries around them. And so we meet once a month, and we keep the group small, and that's been fantastic. And we've all been writing.
What do you think? Because because again, that's one of the areas that's really taken shape, hasn't it, over the last few years? What do you think it is about that ecological kind of activism that's really appealing to you?
Well, I think once I, had experienced the whole nature of the field, then it didn't make sense to leave nature out of it because we are nature. And again, that's a very Batesonian kind of idea. Uh, and it was, how do you go about that? Now, I don't see too many of the training programs that I'm aware of taking any of that on board, or very much of it on board, any more than they're taking on an awful lot. I don't know, maybe it's different in England, but taking on climate anxiety, in kids and families and stuff like that. It seems to be packaged under different things. So I think that's just, it's a new field, and I don't know if we'll get a chance to make it a bit more relevant to people. But we can only try.
Mm.
I didn't
Interesting
know
about the
feminism was going to be. I mean, after those feminist colloquia in the States, I mean, the women there decided they were going to take over the field, and that's exactly what they did. They took over all the organizations and they took over the journals. And there was a breakthrough, but it was a very concerted effort to do that. And I think, I don't know, they were different times. I don't know that you could do that. You could do it in the 80s, but I'm not sure. I don't know if you could do it now. I don't
Mhm.
have the energy to do it, but I certainly would be supporting people in the background.
And it's interesting you're talking about energy because a lot of the ecological activism has been taken up by younger people, which is very, very, very exciting to
Which is
see sort of
fantastic.
have
Yeah.
that. Yes, very encouraging. Um,
Well,
but
it's
I'm
their
sort of
future, it's their life. We've messed it up for them.
and sort of you thinking about it towards this particular kind of developmental part of your life as well. And I was just sort of thinking about that, in we've kind of just gone through little snippets of your amazing kind of journey, but we're sort of being here at this point of your developmental kind of stage, personally and professionally. I was I was just sort of wondering, what are you feeling most proud of in terms of your work and maybe some of the kind of developments that you've been part of?
I think two things. I think one, I think our generation and the generation before us in family therapy made a big difference to how people were treated, and understanding of people's contexts. Um, I think that was an enormous contribution, because before that you had behaviorism and psychodynamic, psychoanalytic kind of paradigms that weren't exploring at that time those kind of social issues. Um, so I think that's something I'm very proud um, of the people that I was associated with that time, and the people who came before me. Like, I mean, I'm thinking of the people who set up family therapy in England, and um, a lot of the women and the men there.
Who would you name as some of those kind of early
Well, I didn't
pioneers
know
in?
the older people, but for example, Alan Coughlin and Jill Garrow Barnes were great friends of mine,
Mhm.
and they did extraordinary work, institutional change work in the UK around family therapy.
Mhm.
Peter and Martin were extraordinary, and I'm not ignoring the women and men that were slightly older than them, who really were the people who laid the groundwork. Um, and I think they laid the groundwork for huge differences that occurred in the treatment of people, and the way services were in many institutions directed. I think when the whole thing of evidence-based therapy and the medicalization of it all came in, it destroyed a lot of that. And also it was taken over by administrators who don't know diddly squat about anything about what people do, and how people are treated. So anyway, that was a huge thing. And the other thing I'm very proud of is the students who went on to carry the field forward. I'm immensely proud of people like Gail Simon and, people here. Valerie O'Brien, who kind of runs one of the training programs here, and some of the other people in the other training program, and just seeing what they've done and continued, to run with the baton and, passing it on to future generations of students. So I'm very proud of that. Not for myself, but just of what they've done and to see their flourishing and see what they've tried to do.
And I mean, just connecting with you there, you had a festschrift in honor of your contribution to the field. Um, and and I'm wondering what you would like to be seen as your legacy, or what were some of the things that were appreciated and spoken about in the festschrift about you that have been a huge contribution to people's lives.
Well, I'd like to see that kind of awakening people to the dangers of colonization and also to the power of love in our work and in our lives. Just kindness, love, taking care of people, or creating um, kind of opportunities for people to experience the excitement of living and the power of connection, and whether that they experience that at an experiential level or whether it's they try to practice that in their lives as um so somebody who's contributed to that. Yes, that's what I'd like to see. And that was so powerful in the day of the
So
fest.
she trying to be very modest, or living to that script about being modest. Do you think?
But it's not something, you see, it's not something that one person can do. So I'm only myself by virtue of the people that are around me and have been around me, that I was supported in that way. And that's why I opened by saying, I've been very privileged by the universe. I have. Because I do feel that we do live in a field of interconnection. And if people hadn't allowed me or supported me or catalyzed me in a particular direction, I wouldn't be doing what I've been doing, and I wouldn't be who I am. So I'm immensely grateful for that, and I'd rather focus on that than all the awful things we're doing at the moment in the world.
For
And where
sure.
we can do that for each other, I think there's a real need to build community, and I don't mean particular kinds of communities. I mean building community with people where we care for them, where we look out after their interests, and really look hard at how we can contain a lot of the division and divisiveness that's going on, and people feeling the right to say whatever comes into their mind, no matter how awful it is, Um,
You were sort of making me think about how when we were talking earlier about that very enriching kind of period of your life in the 80s, where there was a lot of those kinds of different kinds of communities, international, transatlantic, global, that were coming together and
yeah,
kind of coming together from those much more bigger global communities into quite an intimate space with each other, and creating, co-creating, and kind of influencing each other to kind of make real developments in the field. And I was just being reminded of being in a teaching session with some of my students, and where John Burnham was talking about the development of the field. And one of my students said, "Oh, it sounds like there isn't much for us to do. It's all kind of gone, it's all happened. And all the sort of developments have happened, and all the great people have happened. What are we going to be doing, as the future kind of generation of family therapists?" So I was just wondering what you might say to our students, to our new kind of generation communities of the future family therapists. Where do you think the edge is in terms of what they might be going on to contribute and develop?
I actually feel the world is coming round to something like what we had in the 70s and the 80s. I mean, there were dark times back then, and particularly, for many, many countries coming through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s when we had Thatcher and and Reagan. I think that the students need to become much more brave. And I think, they need community, building community in whatever way they do it. And to start talking with each other, because if you looked at how a lot of the models were built, they were built by in conversational groups. The Milan team went and they met in a cafe around the corner, a coffee shop, and they talked. We enclosed ourselves behind one-way screen and we talked. And that's what a lot of the other teams did. They kind of enclosed themselves and they created a kind of a greenhouse, for themselves to a glass house or no, a place that was protected for them to have conversations and to explore ideas and practices. So I think they need to be doing that. And also interrogating. I think a lot of the practice experience of reflexivity has been lost about how are the discourses in society informing and deforming our conversations here, informing and deforming our practices, and how do we situate ourselves in that field of reflexivity so that we don't unconsciously reconstitute something that's unequal, unfair, or, is not even in our own professional interest to do so. The other thing is, I think we need to remember there are no cameras in the rooms. And even though people are told you need to be ticking boxes and, dotting I's and crossing T's and all that sort of thing, if you are in an unfair, inequitable system, then your calling is, for me, is to be subversive in that. So what are the ways that you can be subversive? You don't want to be subversive to the degree that you're going to be fecked out, but we need to be subversive. So I think that's a calling for students. And the other thing is they need to get up off their asses and stop complaining.
Stop complaining about.
Yeah, poor me, and why can't I do it? And that, nobody's going to hand it to you on a plate. You've got to make it happen together.
Sort of
Find some
really
people,
calling them into action.
calling them into action. That's what I mean by get up off your arse and stop complaining.
And I guess that sort of connects maybe finally with one of my sort of final questions. But if for trainees to be kind of subversive, I was wondering what advice you would want to give to as an elder of the field and as a pioneer as well, and as someone who has done a lot of training. What would you say to training organizations and trainers like ourselves, about the ways in which they might hold on to that subversive kind of tradition?
Well, they need to be talking about it. I mean, one of the things that I think that we were very strong about when students came in to us, we would say, you need to learn to become multilingual. You need to be certainly bilingual so that you can have a systemic understanding, but you can speak to your colleagues in their language. And that's one way of being subversive. So people get invited to being interested into a different way of looking and talking. I remember being at a conference where Nora Bateson was speaking and John Shotter was there, and there was about 50 people in the room. And I remember one person saying, "But how can we talk like that? You're talking in a different way." And my thing is, you've got to train to talk in that way. And part of it is teaching people about reflexivity, not just what I call selfie culture, which is doing a piece of research that's all about I, and I had this feeling and that feeling, and I responded this way and that way and the other way. Who gives a shit? If you want to really bring the field forward, you have to be looking at what works for clients, what was said, what was the client's response to that, and you need to look at it in an interaction within a context, and not, as I'm seeing too much of this, what I call selfie research, which is first-person research. That's not systemic.
Sort of something more about bringing those different contexts in.
Yeah.
Which is, yes. And really interesting about that focus on context. And as we come to the end of the kind of conversation, I'm just wondering, because we've kind of traversed the journey and of you right from the time you were young right up until sort of now, crossing so many different kind of contexts. And I'm wondering if there is something. There are a lot of questions that I did ask and that we did talk about, but is there anything that really stands out for you that you wish I had asked you, or that we had talked about, and you felt was somehow missing from the conversations?
No, I'm really interested in the way that you took the conversation, and I loved talking to you. So, no, I don't really have, there's always more to be said about everything, but I don't know what it is right now. And I just enjoyed it so much. I hope that you get what you want out of it, and that I didn't go too much off script or whatever it was. But I thought some of your questions for me were really interesting questions, and not something that I would have, because you had sent me some questions to expect, but you asked them in a really interesting way, that I kind of wouldn't talk. And it was really nice to go back and revisit my parents, um, that was lovely. I just loved that. I don't take the opportunity or get the chance to honor them enough. Um,
Well, I really enjoyed having this conversation with you, Imelda, and thank you so much for taking us down that journey and talking about those early influences of your parents who were social activists in various kinds of ways, and who were already challenging and had that ability to really stand up for and speak their minds. And you spoke in your mind a lot today as well, and what you were saying about your, you know, those kind of different aspects of your parents. They could really be here. They were there in the ways that you spoke, as well as all of those other people professionally that you met. And yes, there's so much more. I sort of found myself thinking, oh, I want to ask her this. Oh, I want to kind of say this. So there's these conversations will continue, and I hope that people will really get a sense of what a really amazing journey you've had, and what an important person you are to our field. And I think one of the things for me, that I've been very conscious of, is that we don't get to celebrate our heroes and sheroes, sort of, I think America tends to do a lot of, and maybe psychoanalytic psychotherapy, they tend to write books about the people who have been pioneers, but we haven't yet had a book about Imelda McCarthy or Jill Gorrell Barnes, or and so I think there's something, I'm hoping that there's something about these conversations which is a way of celebrating your life and your contributions,
Well,
personal and professional.
I feel very celebrated, shall I say? Certainly by the fish drift and by lots of other stuff that's happened in my life, and yeah, and by you. Thank you very much, and I hope we'll get to meet physically
I
before
hope so
too long.
too. I hope so
Even
too.
though I don't travel at all now, and but yeah, I hope I'd like that. And thank you
Thank
so
you.
so so much. Yeah.